In my world, in the trauma world, and especially in the world of trauma psychology, we hear a lot about the survivor mission. It's a distinct phenomenon. People who are encountered with enormous violence and cruelty and adversity, and who respond in part by undertaking some great labor designed to give this event some meaning bigger than the wounds, physical or psychic, that they carry away from it. And if I think of the concept of the survivor mission, it's hard to think of a better exemplar. A better exemplar than Jennifer, who in 2004 went through some very difficult events, which we'll be watching a video of, and who's emerged as a survivor expert on gun issues, as a gun owner, and as a survivor advocate on gun issues. She also is someone who has worked very effectively, at least from time to time, in partnership with journalists, including Mark Follman from Mother Jones. Now, tomorrow, Mark is going to lead us in a conversation in our sort of journalist-to-journalist day that gets under the hood of his reporting and some of his work with Jennifer in that way. But we're going to start this afternoon with a three-way conversation, and then a conversation with all of you about the survivor's perspective, the advocate's perspective, and even as an individual, how you perceive these issues playing out. We'll start by looking at a video, two videos that accompany Mark Follman's recent work in Mother Jones, that lay out some of what happened and that take us into the story a bit, and then we'll have a conversation from there.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah, I got it here.
Urban North Phoenix, outside the restaurant where I was shot a little over 10 years ago. My fiance and I had just returned from a very long trip and drove down here just a couple miles away to go through the drive-thru and just pick up a sandwich at this drive-thru Mexican restaurant before we went home. You know, I can't help but approach this and think about that night. We were holding hands, we were planning our wedding, we were different. So we made this turn, and we were sideswiped right here. David stopped, and we started to get out of the vehicle, and then he said, "Get down." And someone from that vehicle just started firing a gun. David had been shot 3 times, once through his shoulder, and another bullet went through his wrist and into his brain. And then there was a break, and David started to drive away. He crashed into this palm tree right here, that little spot there. 2 more shots were fired. Shot number 5 hit me in the back.
Hello, this is 911. I've been shot. Where are you shot in your body? I don't know. I cannot move. I'm dying and I can't breathe anymore.
And I kept telling anyone that would come near me, I grabbed hold of him and said, "Please tell my son I love him." And now I'm a T4 paraplegic. I'm paralyzed from the middle of my chest down. And that's that. I think that's a good place to take a break, don't you? Once you are painted by gun violence. Once it leaves its mark on you, it's permanent. And you pay it every day. I don't think people understand the way that nickels and dimes add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars over the lifetime of an injury. Hello, big boy. Hello, big boy. Hello, big boy. I do not get love. Welcome to my house. This is a 1926 bungalow that I bought, but in order to live here, I have to make extensive modifications. You know, I can't reach into the upper cabinets. I can't reach deep into a lower cabinet. I held out about $40,000 in order to do all my renovations. It's not quite enough. Nothing was ever going to be simple or easy again. The modifications to this van were about $35,000 just to put in the lift, the steering. My car insurance costs are double what they were. Yeah, so being disabled is really expensive. Okay, here we go. This is, I think, one of the most tranquil places in the entire valley. That's one of the biggest costs I have. Loss of center and a sense of tranquility and well-being. And that's why I love to be here. 2 of us were shot that night in that car. Hundreds of people were impacted directly by it. Shattering families, shattering businesses, shattering communities, changing everything. What it's cost our families and our loved ones, the price of a loss of innocence for my, at the time, 12-year-old child. What it's cost him in terms of not being able to study for exams because mom might be dying today. Certainly initially, you know, I dealt with multiple surgeries. You know, bills started coming in, $18,000, $30,000. And when my mail would show up, I mean, at first I started opening them and there would be this sense of panic. And then it just became so overwhelming where it's like, don't even open it. I had never not paid a bill before that. Total cost of the bullet that shattered my spine? Everything, I don't know. It's hard to measure, probably in the neighborhood of $5 million. Just for the first 10 years.
It's interesting to watch you watch that.
Yeah.
That's
Well-
sit next to you and watch.
Yeah. Thank you both. And
Wait, where are the cocktails?
yeah. We'll get there. We'll get there. And you know, Jennifer, now as a just as a journalist, I have to thank you for the courage it takes just to revisit an incident and the last decade in that kind of a detail with a colleague. No matter how many times you tell it, no matter how many times you do or don't go over the history, every time you encounter it coming out of yourself or encounter it yourself on screen, it's an act of courage, and we thank you for that.
No, thank you.
Let me start off asking you to talk a little bit about how you moved, how you began to engage not only with your own needs, but with the broader issue of guns as a public issue. How did that happen for you?
Well, certainly in part because I had nothing but time. You know, being paralyzed, I had nothing but time to lay and stare at a ceiling and think and come to some conclusions. When we were shot, although there was a period of time where I was in a medically induced coma and I was, in ICU and drugged up, so, whatever was going on in the world really didn't matter to me at that point. I learned later that we were part of a raging 8-day news cycle. Nothing better to talk about here in the Valley that week, apparently. We always made it, now see, this is where I've learned a lot about journalism. I'm gonna sound like I know what I'm talking about. We were in the A block, we were above the fold, like every day for 8 days. And after I was released from the hospital and starting to go about my life, there would be people that would go, oh, you're the one. Oh, weren't you that martial artist that got shot? And then they'd get part of it right and enough of it wrong that I ended up, having to speak about it. And then later on, about 6 months post-injury, law enforcement asked me to do a series of interviews, hoping that we would generate some information that would help them solve the case. It's never been solved. I'm not bitter about that at all. And in doing those interviews, I learned a lot about journalism. Actually, I learned why I hated journalism. Some of it was intrusive, some of it was manipulative, and some of it was downright dishonest. And I learned that if I was going to be stuck doing this, that I had to learn how to do it right. And I don't know that I do, but I think I'm better at it now than I was 6 months post-injury.
And what about kind of beginning to take on gun violence as a political issue, not just as a personal one? How did that happen?
I was asked once to speak about my injury. It was at a fundraiser for, they were trying to build some ramps for something somewhere else in the city. And someone came up and started shaking their finger in my face about being a gun grabber, because I mentioned that I'd been shot. And I don't take to that very well. So again, out of that came this need that if these things are going to happen, then I have to learn to talk about it and talk about it well. And I do feel that I do have some, at least moral authority to speak on this issue. A lot of people can talk about what they think would happen in a situation, and that's all hypothetical. But I can tell you what really happens when bullets start flying.
What is it, what do you wish journalists knew about what happens when bullets start flying or afterwards? What's the piece we usually miss?
Wow. I really have trouble with the sensationalism, how salacious it sounds. It becomes violence porn, in a lot of cases, and that's very difficult to hear. I think and now I'm talking about in terms of like the mass shootings, the ones that make breaking national news, this obsession with the shooter and every detail and their Facebook page and all of these images of them, that's really hard for me. And I think that media does us a disservice when they make the shooter sexy. Cut it out.
Can you repeat that for the last?
I just said cut it out. I was
No,
being a
right
smart.
before.
I think that you do us a disservice when you make the shooter sexy.
Okay.
Can you expand on that a little bit more, so we know?
I think specifically the trial going on right now in Aurora, the shooter in the Aurora movie theater shooting. That was one that I certainly watched unfold from a different perspective than I had in the past. Less as a victim and more as a person who comments. And certainly my phone started ringing right away. But watching those images of that shooter, watching the coverage now, the coverage of that trial now, a lot of people, they talk a lot about the shooter and about all these interesting details about him, and they show those pictures with the red hair and this sort of thing. And I'd prefer that, wherever possible, that you follow my friend Karen Teeves. We've become friends since that shooting. Her son Alex was murdered in the theater. And so she's launched a movement called No Notoriety. Quit using his name. I mean, how many times in the story do you have to say his name? Can we just start with, his name, defendant in the trial, blah, 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 and then for the rest of the article or the story, talk about the shooter, the defendant? That would be helpful.
A lot of us, I think pretty much everyone in this room, consciously or not, probably strives to do a kind of survivor-centered journalism in one way or another. It's one of the things that would bring people to us here. And a lot of us have struggled with this question of how to portray perpetrators and how much to portray perpetrators. There was a mass shooting in Germany a few years ago in the town of Winnenden, and I spent some time at the local newspaper there, and there the local newspaper editor made the decision to not use the name of the shooter at all in the coverage, which would have been impossible to imagine in the United States. And some of the families in Newtown, some of the families in Colorado have made the same strong suggestion / demand. Don't use the name at all. Would you go that far?
I don't. I'd like you to use it as little as possible. I'd like you to not make them infamous. I'd like you to not create a situation where the Sandy Hook shooter has this, dossier up on his walls of all of these, infamous shooters that he's studying and looking to emulate. I don't think that's helpful in any way.
When I'm going to circle the mark in a minute, but I just want to do one thing here. When you've had encounters with journalists that have gone well, maybe even excluding Mark from it, because he obviously is the king of good encounters. But when things have gone well, including maybe even early on in the first months, what were the components of an encounter with a journalist that you thought this person treated me well, this story was good, that you came away feeling either okay or even enhanced rather than stained or furious by?
Sure, I think that there is this disconnect right away. You have a job to do and a deadline, and this is what you do, right? For me, this is the first time I'd ever encountered it. I had no reason to talk to once, about Girl Scout cookie sales or something. But to suddenly have reporters in your face with microphones and probing questions, the best reporters have been kind, they've been quiet, they've kind of explained the process of what's about to happen, because it's new to me, and now I understand it. And now we have a loose network where we help each other, survivors. Explained, you're going to do an interview. Well, think about this, and this is going to happen. And when they ask you this, you don't have to answer. I didn't know that. One of the most intrusive things that happened in that 8-day cycle when I was first shot was that, all of my neighbors, they knocked on their doors. I guess there was a pile of business cards on my front door. Some journalists tried to get into my hospital room in intensive care. And one of the other things that happened is it didn't take long to figure out that I had a school-aged child and what school my child went to. And one of the local networks went to my son's school the day he went back to class to try and get pictures and to interview all the people there. My son was 12. And I hated journalists after that for a long time. It took a long while for me to develop any kind of trust. My son was 12, and someone wanted to go ask him about his mommy getting shot. That's disgusting.
And with stories that you thought of as that was okay, that went well, what did they tend to focus on?
They were fact-based. They gave me room to talk about, my experience, my feelings, whatever that might be. And again, they were, the word that comes to mind, they were quiet. That's what you've done too, Mark. You've asked questions. We went places in the time that we spent together that I've never allowed a journalist to go. And in part, it was because you were kind and you were quiet and you gave me room to think it through, and then to kind of maybe take a minute to regain my composure before we went any further. That's helpful.
Mark, what were you were trying to chime in there?
Well, I just wanted to share a couple thoughts about the question about focusing on the shooters versus the victims. I mean, I think we could spend hours just discussing that. I think it's a huge and important question. It's a very worthy debate. I've focused on this subject intensively for 3 years now, and it started with mass shootings. The first big project I did was building a database of mass shootings and thinking about it forensically. And I think that's an imperative with gun violence. If that's the reason you're focusing on the shooters, that's important. But there's a line that can be crossed very easily, and I think some journalists and publications probably do it without even realizing it. Early on in my delving into this subject, it's people like Jen and other survivors I've gotten to know who really helped me evolve my thinking a little bit on this question. A young woman named Christina Anderson, who was one of the victims that survived the Virginia Tech mass shooting. I met with her early on in some of my reporting, and she really impressed upon me the need to tell victim stories more, to allow the focus to be more on the victims, at least equally on the victims, if not more. I think, there's some questions of how you balance that with your mission as a journalist to expose information that is important to the public debate and to shed light on an issue. There's a lot of reason to report on James Holmes right now, whose trial is going on. I just put up a story on Mother Jones today about some things in his diary that speak to the debate over so-called gun-free zones. In my view, that is a kind of forensic focus that is not only deserved but necessary. And so I'm writing about him and I'm naming him in that story, and the focus is on him and not the victims, but it's with a very specific purpose. And I think at the same time, always asking that question is important when covering this subject. Am I saying his name too many times? Am I focusing on him too much? Where that balance is can move, can change. And my thinking on this question has changed. So I think just being aware of it is alone is a great start.
Jen, let me ask you something. When you've been here all day, so you kind of heard the expert briefings and the questions folks have. When you, as a survivor, as an advocate, are hearing these kinds of statistics and numbers go by, where do you put yourself in that? Are you looking at this as a kind of a framing of you? Is it outside of you? How do you relate to all of this?
Well, none of the numbers I heard today were a surprise to me.
Right.
I think that data is important in this discussion, and it can't be a hysterical conversation. I got shot, so guns are bad. It's important to have, if we're having a public policy discussion, to understand what it is we're talking about. So that hasn't been an issue for me at all. But what I have kind of been sitting over here watching, inside myself from outside myself, or however, is as the other presenters have talked about different shooting events that have happened, and they'll be talking about something specific, I'm like, that's my friend Pat that you're talking about. Oh, that was Roger. Oh, that's Mary, that's Karen. And, these are full dimensional people to me. I laugh with them, I cry with them. And I think that that's what I really need you to remember, is that we're not just these flat subjects you need to get information from and move on. Even now, Mark was very gentle and telling my story in the time we were together. We set parameters. He brought a colleague with him who was equally great, and we'll talk about James in a minute here. But I still paid a price afterward for having done the story. And, you know, it takes a toll to do it. For me, you know, it's this cost-benefit analysis. Is what gets out worth the price that I'm going to pay? In this case, it was. But many times, I'm approached regularly to do stories, and I turn them down. I've turned down, I don't know how many, a lot. I do way fewer stories than I'm asked to do.
Mark, what about your I guess your videographer, or was that who you brought with you? Or
Yeah, my co-producer on this film that you just saw, James West, who I have to give a shout out to. He's an amazing filmmaker. You know, worked the camera, did the editing, and was just a wonderful collaborator on this whole project. Yeah.
And what I mean, actually, for any victim of crime, survivor of violence, having a big video camera present can be one of the most daunting parts of the journalism thing. What went right from your point of view in that? What makes you think of that piece of it well?
It was the prep that we did in advance, the parameters that we set that Mark promised that he would abide by, and part of that was languaging around how you talk about my disability. One of the big rules was you can never say confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. And if I find any of you doing it, I will hunt you down. National Center for Disability and Journalism is right here at Cronkite. Please look at their study guide.
Alternative language, please?
Yes, yes.
No, I mean, what would be?
So I'm a person who uses a wheelchair. I am paralyzed. I am, you know, lots of things, but I'm not wheelchair bound. And that takes me, it spins me to something I started to say earlier. In your reporting, one of the things that I often see is that journalists will sugarcoat in some ways. While I see this salaciousness, there's also this sugarcoating. Like, for example, as the Sandy Hook anniversary comes up, you know, reporters will talk about the lives lost. Those children were murdered. They were killed. They weren't lost. Their parents aren't going to go find them somewhere in Georgia or Disney World. They're dead. And I think that when we sugarcoat, and trust me, their parents know that their children are dead. They know they're not lost somewhere. And I think that there is this, and I can see that I've shocked some people by saying that. But I think that when you sugarcoat that language, you soften what these shooters have done in a way that's unfair to us. So I would ask you not to, you know, it wasn't the incident. You know, I didn't have an accident. I was shot by somebody with a gun. And I'd prefer the more straight-on language.
Thoughts, questions? Okay.
You said you also speak with a lot of other people who were shooting victims. Do you find that they feel the same way, and that they would like to have more approach, more honest verbiage and stories?
Well, we're certainly not a monolith, but the individuals that I spend a great deal of time with, I think, would agree. Actually, I know they agree that we'd like to see certainly sensitivity in how you speak to us, but some reality. And again, when you talk about, you know, my loved one was lost, you in some ways, I personally feel, and I've heard other survivors say it, that you denigrate what happened.
I think, if I could just add to that briefly, I think Jen expressed this well earlier, that something that was really valued, that she really valued, was understanding the process a little bit. I mean, especially for a more in-depth kind of story. You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about how we would do this, and then talking with Jen about how we would do this. And for me, one of the governing principles was, when you're dealing with a subject like this, you know, try to do no harm. Is anything that I'm going to ask for or do, you know, hurt her in some significant way? I mean, she has PTSD. This is a very intense thing to get into with somebody personally. And, you know, we had talked about some ideas for this video. I had raised the notion of maybe going to a gun range. You can sort of see the obvious narrative power that might bring to a film. And I was even kind of nervous about asking Jen to do that in advance of coming to Phoenix. And, in the way that she's so great in terms of being straightforward about her feelings, she kind of lays it all right out. She said, I'm not saying no, but, that's a delicate request. And, it might, I can't say exactly how it'll go and, my PTSD. And my takeaway from that was, no, I'm not going to go there. It's just not worth the risk of what might happen to her or anyone else around it. So, I'm not going to just try to chase the most dramatic story at risk of that, period. I thought about it a little bit more. I talked with my colleagues in San Francisco, and then I had the idea, well, maybe we'll ask Jen to take us to the scene where it happened. And then James and I kind of decided, in talking with one of the editors-in-chief, given what we've already discussed, let's just go to Phoenix and see how it feels, and then we'll ask if it feels right. And I thought that makes a lot of sense. Turned out that Jen offered before we even got to Phoenix. She said, "Hey, I'll take you to the parking lot," and we said, "Okay, great, let's do it."
I think it was my peace offering when I told you I wouldn't go to the gun range. We're not going to go shooting, but I'll show you where I got shot.
So I think engaging a source or a subject that you're trying to develop a relationship with for a story in that way is invaluable. It shows them respect and care for their story, and it also helps you figure out what the story is. I didn't know that we would do that video. I had no sense that that's where we were going to go, and until she suggested it, and then we started talking about what that was specifically, and James and I started talking about how we would produce it, and that's also the joy of discovering and telling a powerful story. You often don't know what it is until you're finding your way into it, and I think engaging your subject in this way is invaluable towards that.
Jared, were you?
Jennifer, you mentioned that you paid a price for doing the story. So what was that outside of additional story requests, maybe from journalists?
Although Mark and James were very gentle, they were also, they asked very probing questions, pieces that many times I'd like to not think about on a regular basis. And certainly it awakened some PTSD. The way that I describe it often is when you come and ask me to tell my story, however gently you're asking me that request, there's a part of me that hears, "Hey, Jen, would you do me a favor? Would you open an artery so we can watch you bleed?" We're talking about the night that my entire life changed. I was shot and I coded, I died. My fiance was shot in the head. I lost a big part of him, and we don't talk a great deal about that, and I care not to. But every aspect of my life changed that night. And to drag it out and sit and play with it hurts. And I drank pretty heavily for a couple of days after that.
What sort of response did you get from the public, maybe from the pro-gun side? I mean, you mentioned that some woman approached you and called you a gun grabber or something.
Well, that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. So whenever I poke my head up in public, I can expect that I will get a response as like kicking an anthill. This story wasn't as bad. It wasn't as bad as I expected, and I was really afraid this time, concerned.
And we talked about that a lot too.
We talked about that in advance because Mark and I did another story. That's how I met him, is that he interviewed me as part of a different story that he did, and I hadn't expected how viral that would go. And
but that story was about what you're asking about, which
right.
was people harassing gun violence prevention advocates, including Jen. She became a central piece of that story and was harassed in much more intense and serious ways for that.
Right. I get death threats, rape threats. They come, through Facebook, through Twitter, through the mail. I'll have indications, little gifts left that I know that that the message is, "Hello, Jennifer, I know exactly where you live." These kind of things. It can be very intense. It can be very intense when it's happening, and that's part of why I pick and choose which stories I'll do.
Yeah.
That's actually where I wanted to go. Thank you, first of all, for being here. And I wrote down what you said, to drag it out and play with it hurts. I think those were your words, and I think that, if we take nothing else from what you said today, is what we should remember when we're talking to anybody who's experienced some sort of really traumatic event. To drag it out and play with it hurts. Because I think that's probably what it feels like a lot of times. Is journalists are playing with it and trying to get the best story or the scoop. What I was curious about is how your thoughts or needs or feelings have changed from when this first happened and you were being approached for interviews till now. And like, did you want different things when it first happened? And do you want different things from journalists now? Or like, what advice would you give for journalists in the heart of the incident and then later on in follow-up stories?
I think the thing that has changed most is that I've developed some experience. And and a journalist wants to talk to me. I ask different questions now than I did before. And I think Mark can attest to this. Is this print or broadcast? And you know, hi, I'd like to do an interview. Print or broadcast? And all of a sudden, they know that they're dealing with, you know, someone different. I almost sound like a PIO sometimes. How long is your piece? Where's it going to be aired? What are you doing with it? I ask different questions than I ever did before. I now feel free to set parameters. By the way, this is the National Center on Disability and Journalism Style Guide. Make sure you read it before you come speak to me. If one of you were to interview me, we would make sure that had happened.
Quick takeaway for the Dart Center website. Let's get that up there.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Gilger. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have felt that I could do that. And so I think that's what's changed, is that I've become, I recognize that I can play a part in shaping the parameters for the story. I've also come to recognize, by the way, my son graduated from the School of Journalism. Yay! He's pretty freaking amazing.
And was that a way of supporting mom or rebelling against mom? I guess that's
my son's going to be a writer. He was going to be a writer since he was 3. And I've actually lectured at this school. So I recognize the value of journalism, and I recognize that you have a job to do. And so now what I think I try to do is protect myself as, this subject of a story, but at the same time I recognize that you're trying to put out the best possible product. And I think I have gotten better at figuring out how to help you do that without hurting myself in the process.
On this question of sort of the passage of time, has what you want politically, what you feel yourself advocating for, changed over the last 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started talking, I wanted justice. Actually, when I first started talking, maybe I wanted vengeance. Then I wanted justice for myself.
And justice meaning what?
I wanted the individuals responsible for shooting us, caught, tried, convicted, punished, put below the jail, never to be heard of again. I moderated that over time. I think I was more extreme in my views on gun reform early on. I had been a gun owner, I still am a gun owner, but then I was this victim of crime. And for a while, I think that my views were a little more extreme. And that was certainly related to the trauma of my injury and the trauma of everything it cost us. And I think that as I've gotten some distance, as I've gotten a thicker skin, and you get that from journalists, thank you all very much, and from legislators who will look you in the eye and say, incredibly blunt things. I think that I've gotten more practical in what I want.
Yes.
I have a question. You say you've spoken here at this journalism school, and I'm curious if A, you speak at other journalism schools, and B, if there are any programs in journalism schools across the country, or lectures or classes, because I think that a lot of us here are hungry for this kind of stuff. I didn't know, for example, about the style guide, right, the disability style guide, which I think is excellent, right, because I think a lot of us don't even think about that kind of terminology and what kind of effect that has. And just this idea of giving the subject or working with the subject and having agency, right? Do you feel comfortable with this? And just sort of that kind of partnership. I think all of us, we just need someone to tell us, right?
Right.
We just don't know.
That's a conversation Elizabeth and I had at lunch today. Thank you very much. Do I speak at other journalism schools? I've not been invited to. I only do two things. I do gun violence prevention and I do disability advocacy. So I'm always happy to talk about either one of those. Ask Mark, I'll talk until you tell me shut up. And then I'll still talk. And if there are cocktails wherever your journalism school is, I'm in.
You should be visiting newsrooms.
That's it.
Well,
Right.
well, and I will say, just on this sort of point of information, that there are now a number of journalism schools around the country where journalism educators who worked with us at the Dart Center have put in one or another kind of curriculum that often involves bringing survivors of crime or other traumatic events into the classroom, along with dealing with trauma and others. One of them is Jim McMillan, who you'll hear about tomorrow. He taught a whole course on trauma and journalism in Philadelphia, and there's some other folks like that. So there is a conversation among journalism educators about how to do it, but you have a standing invitation to come to Columbia.
Awesome.
To be
I'm
discussed
there.
later. That's we have time for a few more. Go.
I want to revisit this idea of naming the perpetrator. I found that the families of the victims of the Gainesville student murders kept saying you were using his name way too much. Mm-hmm. Is it a sense of power as a victim? You've been victimized once, and now you are losing the power to this unnamed person who's gaining this. Talk a little bit more about, I think most reporters don't realize this. Talk a little bit more in depth about what you mean by naming, because as a journalist, we have to name the guy or gal who did it, but how do we avoid hurting you further by doing that?
Right, so how many times in the story, though, do you have to say their name? We'll go with Aurora, because that's currently what's going on, and I'm eager to read the story that you've just written. But, I imagine that if you're writing a story, you have to start with, James Holmes, blah, 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 whatever your lead is, right? But then for the rest of the story, do you have to continue to say his name? Can't he now, you've already identified him, right? Can't he be the shooter for the rest of the story? The alleged shooter? Can't he be the defendant? Or, some terminology along those ways? I'm going to ask Mark to say more, but, being the victim of a violent crime is it's a huge violation. And to say that is just such an understatement, to sound almost trite. And I think that putting their name out there over and over and over again, it's victimizing all over again. And I don't know how that furthers your story. And so, now I've come to read these things from this different point of view, more as less as a victim and less as, just a consumer of news, and more from this critique process. Why did you choose to say it that way?
I've come to think that the sort of literal debate about naming the shooter and how much their name appears is in some ways academic. I think it's more the overall framing and feel and tone of the story. What is the focus of the story? What's the purpose? And then are you staying within the bounds of that in using the shooter's name? I think it's a tough balancing act sometimes, but I think if the thrust of the story is true to its purpose, then, and there aren't aspects of it that seem gratuitous about that individual. It can be tough not to name. I think the story I put up today uses his last name repeatedly because it's a story about him, his diary. To me, it seems appropriate to the subject.
I will just say this is actually a worldwide debate. I mean, for example, in Australia, not too long ago was the 10th anniversary of the Port Arthur shootings, 15th anniversary of the Port Arthur shootings, and on that anniversary, there were a number of victim groups of survivor groups that asked the Australian news media not to use the name of the shooter. And actually, behind the scenes, the Dartser ended up mediating some conversations to try to figure this out, because you were not going to do an anniversary story without naming, and yet there was this very strong argument. I think there is the articulated reason is very often these are crimes committed by individuals seeking notoriety, and we should not reward them with notoriety. That argument has led Dave Cullen, who wrote Columbine, the great account of the Columbine shootings, to himself now argue that we should be avoiding the use of names. To which I said to him, well, how are you going to write your fucking book? But
Well, you know what else is...
but just to finish, I think it is partly a surrogate issue for as Jenna Markle was saying, it's a surrogate issue for everything else that's imbalanced and goes wrong in the journalism victim encounter. I also think it's a surrogate for something else, which is that in surviving a hideous violent crime or something like this is, among other things, an enormous loss of control. You lose control of everything except sometimes the story.
Yeah.
And the question of whose story it is, whose news is this? Is it who should be the subject of coverage is often the unspoken issue. And I'm not proposing I have an easy answer for that. Right.
I think also, I was just going to say that, it occurs to me that I think my answer to this has really become that it is a holistic process of making the story. So whether it's the name or it's the big Joker hair face of James Holmes on your story, do we need that now? We saw that a lot after the event. I'm not sure we need that now to talk about the trial. I understand Karen's idea and pushing for just don't name the shooter. There's a very powerful symbolic statement in that. It may not be entirely practical to the work of journalism. I understand where it's coming from, but I think it speaks to that broader framing of the work that you're doing. I mean, it strikes me too, Jen, that this really interesting question is, in a certain sense, you'd like to be able to name the person in your case, because we don't know who it is.
I'd love to be able to point to someone.
That's the other
Right.
end of the spectrum,
Right.
right? There is no shooter to name, and that tells
Right.
you why we do it in the first place, to some
So
degree.
actually, if I could just really
Yeah.
quick, I have a quick little experiment here. So today, we've talked several times about the January 8th shooting in Tucson. That's how we refer to it here, the January 8th shooting, Tucson shooting. I've heard a number of people call it the Gabby Gifford shooting. Do you know how many people were shot that day?
19.
There were 19 people shot, right? Can you name anyone besides Gabby?
The federal judge, I don't remember his name. but
Yeah,
we've got
Judge
federal
Rollins,
judge
yeah.
on it.
But, so the question I always think about, and I know many of those people now, because I am so immersed in this as a subject. But what I sometimes think about is I wonder what it feels like to be a member of the Stoddard family, to hear this referred to as the Gabby Gifford shooting, as though their own family member has just been completely erased off the face of the earth. They don't even count. You think their loss is any different than any of the others? I mean, and I get that some stories are apparently easier to tell. Christina Taylor Greene, again, her parents are friends of mine. Her story, I get why you zeroed in on that one. But again, when we talk about Gabby and we talk about Christina and that judge, how does it feel to be the Stoddard family?
Well, and that makes me want to ask you something, and we'll come back to it. That makes me want to ask you something. One of the other challenges that reporters face in covering the aftermath of mass shootings, but also covering survivor advocacy, victim advocacy, and so on, is that there are some victims who are very comfortable talking to the press, who are good at it. How, of which you are,
I will say, I think I've gotten good at it. I'm not comfortable with it.
Fair enough.
Okay.
But you are clearly an accessible, articulate public voice. And I guess the question is how we balance, how do you think we should balance working with the people who, like you, put themselves out there at least somewhat, with people like your friends who are forgotten in this? How do we avoid creating kind of a narrow group of professional survivors who are the only voices heard?
Ow, that hurts, being a professional survivor. And I know that wasn't your intent. I don't know. I mean, I get that when something happens, you want people to talk. And I get that you develop a Rolodex of resources to do that. I've kind of gotten to a place where, again, I don't talk to that many people anymore. I certainly got overexposed after the Sandy Hook shootings with a lot of the advocacy we were doing. I was like on, every news channel multiple times. It's like, I'm sick of hearing my voice. I have to imagine the rest of the valley is too. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
No, it's a struggle for all of us. So who, go.
Well, it's a kind of half question, half observation that a lot of times, I think some of these insensitive questions, in my experience, are driven by editors and producers who don't have to go out and actually ask that question, and they hide behind you. And as a journalist, speaking truth to power is really turning around to an editor sometimes and saying, I'm not asking that question. It's like, and that's hard to do because that's your boss.
Have you ever counseled a journalist to do that? Have you ever helped a journalist tell an editor to go to hell?
Me?
Yeah.
I think the media here in the Valley, I mean, this is it's what, I don't know, a mid-size market. I certainly know my way around all the media outlets here in the Valley, and they all know how I feel on certain things. And, these are folks that I see outside of these roles. Some of them are my friends. Some of them come to my home. And they know exactly what they can ask and what they can't. And sometimes I'll be watching a news story and I'll pick up a phone and call someone at home and say, I can't believe you guys put that on the air. You suck. Yeah.
Go.
Can I do a follow-up to my colleague's question? Mark, can you talk about, I mean, I know your title is editor, so maybe you haven't, but I really feel like that was a really important point you were making. And a lot of times it is people back at the shop, and then the journalists are out on the ground having a very different experience and struggling with this tension. So I was wondering if you could talk about navigating that as a journalist, and also navigating, in your case, part of covering trauma or traumatic situations is this relationship and really understanding the story. You're sharing someone's story. So it requires time. But we were talking in this era of the one-man band journalist, sometimes time is not really there. So how do you navigate talking to editors and sort of getting more time beyond like making a huge special project out of the situation?
And spend a few minutes on it. I'm sure we will end up picking that up tomorrow as a major theme as well. But
yeah, I'll try to just give you a quick answer, and we can talk more about it tomorrow. But the first part in terms of relationship with the editor, I mean, I don't know that I'm a great person to ask that for a good reason, which is that I work with remarkable people who are very supportive and collaborative, and so that dialogue is open. I mean, I can push back on anything I want. If you're not in a position to do that, I guess you have to pick your battles. But if you're put into a position where you feel like you're doing something morally or ethically wrong, I would put my foot down. Maybe that's not the best place for you to work if that's what's going on. In terms of time, in some ways, this project was the culmination of many stories I did over the last 3 years. So in that sense, it was the time of the cumulative work. And I think by the time we got to this project, the question of how much does gun violence cost, or what does gun violence cost, really started for me with Aurora when I started doing all the reporting I did on gun violence. I talk about this a little bit in the story. We were asking that question from the get-go, but we didn't really start to seriously focus on it until maybe a year ago, and start thinking about how can we get real data on this and find stories to tell around it. I think buy-in from my bosses and my collaborators was obviously essential. Once everyone agreed this is an important thing for us to do and we're going to invest in it, then that time was there. But there's still the day-to-day, right? I mean, I have a lot of demands on me with quick stories and people I'm editing as well. I'm the role of reporter on this primarily, but how do you balance that mix is a pretty unwieldy question these days. So maybe more on that tomorrow.
Okay, one or two more, yeah.
I hear, Jen, how you think that we should approach victims. You said that after you were shot, people tried to contact you and people around you in very intrusive ways. And some people respond well to being asked about their loved ones who have been hurt and killed, and because they want to have an opportunity to talk about it, talk about their experience, and get everything out there. And some people really don't want the media to contact them in any way at all. And it's impossible to know like who will want to talk and who won't want to talk. So how do you suggest that we go about it in a way that is productive, sensitive, and gentle?
And not traumatizing?
And not traumatizing.
I think that, there's not a single formula for who's going to talk and when is a good time and this sort of thing, but I think that based on what I heard, while, I wasn't, within the first 24 hours, my friends, my loved ones didn't even know if I was going to live or not. And there are, news crews at the front door, the light on and the guy's right there knocking on the door and a microphone being thrust in the door as they're answering. I think that perhaps if someone had knocked, if you had come up first without the equipment, hi, I'm from, this news outlet and we'd like to talk to you about, Jen, could I ask you a couple of questions? I understand this is a difficult time, whatever. But, maybe show a little sensitivity first. That would have been the way to do it. I don't know. You seem to have good success getting people to talk to you. How do you do it?
Well, this is making me think of something else that I think is really important when you're dealing with a subject like this and with a person like Jen. You're developing a relationship. Let's stipulate you've got the time you need to develop this and do a story like this. I think another thing that's important to be aware of and careful about is your own sense of personal relationship to your subject. And, I was very careful with Jen. I mean, she would tell you this too. I can say this in front of her because I know she gets it. But there were several points during this process where I kind of stepped back and said, Jen, I have a lot of respect for Jen. She's an extraordinary person, as you can see, in a number of ways. But I had to say also at certain...
I'm single. Okay,
not least for her dry sense of humor. But there were moments where I said, look, I'm here as a journalist, and this is what I need from you. I mean, there were a couple points where I remember we turned off the recorders. I said, Jen, I'm going to turn the recorder off, and I need you to tell me about X, because I needed to know something that she didn't want to talk about that was really important to me being able to report with confidence what I was going to report about the crime that occurred. And you're in territory where you're developing a sense of friendship and connection. And, I had to make clear, I'm not asking you as your friend. You know why I'm asking you this. This is why I need to know this. And I think it's just very important to always keep that in mind as you've won a subject's confidence. You're thinking about what's going to happen to them and what you're doing to them, but you also need to think about what it's doing to you, and make sure that you're, doing your job as you're supposed to.
And I think even in breaking news situations, there are gestures of control you can make, those little steps of seeking permission, of being transparent, explaining just that extra sentence, that extra half sentence, that make all the difference in a subject feeling that you're part of a system of respect for them, or you're part of a world that has isolated them and left them off on an iceberg somewhere. So,
on the national front, for example, when these stories break, I've seen some journalists do some things, drag children in front of the camera to talk about what they've seen and this sort of stuff. And when those journalists have contacted me, hi, I'd like to interview you, it's like, yeah, that's never gonna happen, ever.
Keep the blacklist.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
share notes on you
Yeah.
guys, we do.
Yeah.
We know which of you are jerks and which of you are good to your word.
We were talking about terminology, and one thing that has surprised me in interviewing people that have experienced gun violence is the word victim.
Mhm.
And actually, some people don't like that word. It sounds, it has a certain negative connotation. I wonder what your take on that is, and whether that's a question you should ask when you're interviewing people who have experienced gun violence, whether they are victims or not.
I would hope that you would follow whatever identity a person chose to wear. How they identify themselves would be what you would honor. I would tell you that I have come to a place personally where I was victimized by gun violence 10 years ago. I'm a survivor of gun violence now. And there are certainly moments, you know, I fell and broke my ribs last night because of all of this, okay? So there are moments when I still feel victimized by the bullet that hit me in the back years ago. But I survived, and I want to come to this from a position of strength, not from, you know, this place of weakness.
I think that's as good a place as any to call it an evening.
Awesome.
Jen, thank you so much.
Thank you.